The scent of lemon polish and old wood was the smell of Amelia's life. It was a clean scent, a scent of order, of a home meticulously cared for. For 20 years, that had been her domain. The sprawling house with its gleaming floors and dust-free surfaces was her masterpiece, a silent testament to her dedication. Her husband Richard often said as much. "What would I do without you, darling?" he'd remark, patting her hand before his eyes drifted to the television or his phone. "You keep this whole ship afloat." But he wasn't talking about the real ship, the one that was sinking. That ship was named the Gilded Spoon. It had been their dream, born on a cheap bottle of wine on their third date. Amelia, a passionate home cook with her grandmother's book of recipes, had the soul. Richard, with his business degree and sharp suits, had the ambition. She had envisioned a cozy, warm place where every dish felt like a hug. He had envisioned a high-end establishment, a place to be seen. They had compromised, or so she thought. But over the years, the gilded part had taken over, and the spoon, the simple, nourishing part that was her contribution, had been forgotten. It was Richard's restaurant now. That's what everyone said. "Richard's place is doing wonderfully," their friends would say at dinner parties. Amelia would just smile, a practiced, gentle curve of her lips. She had designed the original menu, taste-tested every dish until it was perfect, and even hand-stitched the first set of curtains that hung in the private dining room. But those contributions were like old photographs, faded and stored in an attic. Now she was just the housewife, the woman behind the successful man. The first crack in the facade appeared on a Tuesday. Richard came home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and frustration. He threw his briefcase onto the antique console table with a thud that made Amelia jump. "Long day?" she asked, her voice soft. "You have no idea," he grumbled, loosening his tie. "Expenses are through the roof. This new chef, Antoine, has a taste for truffles that would make a king blush, and the linen company is charging a fortune." He paced the living room, a lion in a cage of his own making. "I don't know how we're supposed to stay profitable with these costs." Amelia listened patiently. She had ideas. She had always had ideas. "Richard, I was thinking," she began hesitantly, "maybe we could go back to the old supplier for the produce. Mr. Henderson's farm-to-table prices were always reasonable, and the quality was superb. It would add a story to the menu, too. Local, fresh." Richard stopped pacing and looked at her, but it was a look that went right through her. "Amelia, please," he said, his voice laced with a weary condescension. "Let me handle the business side of things. It's complicated. It's not like balancing a household budget." The words stung, sharp and familiar. He didn't mean to be cruel, she told herself. He was just stressed. So she retreated, as she always did, back into the quiet hum of the house. She went to tidy up, picking up his briefcase to place it in his study. But the latches were open and a stack of papers slid out, fanning across the polished floor. Receipts. She knelt to gather them, her brow furrowing. A receipt for a $1,000 case of champagne she'd never heard of. A bill from a high-end jewelry store, marked client gift. And then, the one that made her breath catch in her throat, a hotel bill for a suite on a night Richard was supposedly on a business trip to a conference one town over. Her heart began to pound, a frantic drum against the silent, orderly backdrop of her life. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the trust, the shared dream that now felt like a lie. He was complaining about the cost of linens while spending lavishly on things that had nothing to do with the restaurant. Her restaurant. Their restaurant. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, the scent of lemon polish replaced by the cold scent of betrayal. The Gilded Spoon wasn't just a business. It was the repository of her youth, her passion, her identity. And he was carelessly, thoughtlessly, driving it into the ground while treating her like a decorative fixture in his life. The woman who balanced the household budget was, after all, the one who knew the true value of every penny earned and every dream invested. And a quiet, steely resolve began to form in the deepest part of her soul. He had forgotten who she was. It was time to remind him. The next morning, Amelia's movements were the same, but the intention behind them had shifted. She made the coffee, she straightened the cushions, she wiped down the gleaming kitchen counters, but it was no longer the routine of a contented homemaker. It was the deliberate, calming ritual of a general preparing for battle. The house was her fortress, and from within its walls, she would plan her campaign. Richard had left early, a brief kiss on her cheek that felt more like a formality than affection. "Big day, darling." "Trying to land a new investor," he'd said, already halfway out the door. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. He was looking for new money while setting fire to the old. Her target was his study. It was the one room in the house that was his, a space of dark leather, mahogany, and self-importance. She had always respected its boundaries, but those boundaries, she now realized, had been used to hide a world from her. Armed with the name of the hotel from the receipt, she sat down at his oversized desk. Her hands were steady as she turned on his computer. She had seen him type his password 100 times, a simple combination. Their anniversary. A fresh wave of anger washed over her. He used the symbol of their union to lock her out of his secrets. It didn't take her long to find what she was looking for. The restaurant's online banking portal. The login was saved. With a deep breath, she clicked. And there it was. A detailed, unforgiving history of their shared dream, documented in the cold, hard numbers of a credit card statement. She started scrolling, going back months. It was worse than she had imagined. Far worse. There were the business expenses she knew about, the suppliers, the payroll, the utilities, but they were drowning in a sea of other charges. Hundreds of dollars for lavish dinners at rival restaurants, listed as market research. Thousands on client gifts from designer stores. There were golf club memberships, weekend trips to cities they had never visited together, and a recurring monthly charge for a luxury car lease she knew nothing about. It was a systematic bleeding of their resources. Richard wasn't just a poor businessman. He was using the gilded spoon as his personal piggy bank, funding a life of luxury and deceit while lecturing her about the cost of farm-fresh vegetables. She printed the statements page after page, the whir of the printer a quiet symphony of her mounting fury. Each sheet of paper was a piece of evidence, a testament to his betrayal. As she laid the pages out on the dining room table, a timeline of his duplicity emerged. The hotel suite wasn't a one-time event. There were others in other cities, all coinciding with his business trips. The jewelry store purchase wasn't for a client. She found the store's website and saw the very necklace from the receipt proudly displayed on their homepage, a delicate, expensive piece she had never seen. The image of another woman wearing it, her neck adorned with the profits of Amelia's own passion and hard work, flashed in her mind. That was the moment the sadness curdled into steel. The grief for her marriage was still there, a hollow ache in her chest, but it was overshadowed by a profound, righteous anger. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about the erasure of her life's work. He had taken her dream, her recipes, her soul, and used them as fuel for his own selfish desires, all while patting her on the head and calling her darling. He saw her as the help, the quiet, reliable woman who kept the house in order so he could go out and play the big shot. He had fundamentally misunderstood who he was married to. She wasn't just the one who polished the silver. She was the one who knew it was real silver in the first place. She sat at the table for a long time. The damning evidence spread before her like a battle map. Her mind, so often occupied with meal plans and social schedules, was suddenly sharp and clear, focused on a single objective. She couldn't save her marriage. It was already a ghost. But she could save the restaurant. She could save her dream. Her gaze fell on the company credit card information listed on the statement. The card that was funding this entire charade. She thought of Richard, probably at a fancy lunch, charming some investor with a story of success built on her back. She thought of how he would react, the rage, the confusion, the sheer disbelief that his quiet, unassuming wife could do something so audacious. A small, unfamiliar smile touched Amelia's lips. It was time to stop balancing the household budget and start balancing the scales of justice. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady as she dialed the number on the back of the card. The automated voice on the other end was a calm, impersonal guide on her path to revolution. To report a card lost or stolen or to request a temporary freeze, it said, "Press 3. She pressed 3. Richard was laughing, a smooth, practiced sound that he used to charm and disarm. He sat across from a man named Arthur Vance, a potential investor with a hawk-like nose and eyes that missed nothing. The lunch was going perfectly. The wine was exquisite, the food was a work of art, and Richard was weaving a grand narrative of the Gilded Spoon's success, a tale of vision and business acumen. His vision, his acumen. "It's all about maintaining standards, Arthur," Richard said, gesturing expansively with his hand. "You can't cut corners on quality. That's what sets us apart." "Indeed," Arthur murmured, taking a slow sip of wine. "And your profit margins reflect this high-end approach?" "Absolutely," Richard lied smoothly. "Our growth is steady, and with a small infusion of capital to, let's say, refresh the decor, we'll be the undisputed king of this city's culinary scene." The bill arrived, presented discreetly on a small silver tray. This was the final act, the casual display of financial strength. Richard placed the company credit card on the tray without a second glance. It was a gesture he'd performed 1,000 times. The waiter returned a few minutes later, looking apologetic. "I'm very sorry, sir," the waiter whispered, leaning in. "The card has been declined." Richard's smile froze on his face. "Declined? That's impossible. Run it again." "We have, sir. 3 times. It appears there's a hold on the account." A hot flush of humiliation crept up Richard's neck. He could feel Arthur Vance's sharp eyes on him. This was a catastrophic failure, a crack in the perfect facade he had built. Fumbling in his wallet for his personal card, he forced a laugh. "Goodness. My wife, you know. Probably saw a suspicious charge and panicked. She's a worrier." He tried to make it a charming, relatable anecdote, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. The moment he was in his car, the charm evaporated, replaced by cold fury. He jabbed at his phone's screen, dialing Amelia's number. She answered on the second ring. "What did you do?" he barked. No preamble, no hello. "Good afternoon, Richard." Amelia's voice came through the speaker, impossibly calm. It was the voice she used with telemarketers. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Don't play games with me, Amelia. My card was just declined. In front of Arthur Vance. Did you call the bank? Did you mess something up?" There was a brief pause. "I didn't mess anything up," she said, her tone as even as a frozen lake. "I did exactly what I intended to do. I froze the account." Richard was so stunned he almost swerved into the next lane. "You what? Why in God's name would you do that? What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about the hotel suites, Richard," she said. And with those 5 words, the world fell out from under him. "I was thinking about the jewelry and the luxury car lease and the $1,000 bottles of champagne. I was thinking about how you told me we couldn't afford a local vegetable supplier while you were funding a secret life with our dream." Silence. He had no response. She knew. "I'll be home in 10 minutes, he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We are going to talk about this." "I know we are," she replied, and hung up. When he stormed through the front door, he found her not in the kitchen, not in the living room, but in the dining room. She was seated at the head of the long, polished table, his seat, and spread out before her were the printed bank statements, a white paper trail of his sins. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a rage that was equal parts fear. "You went through my things, my private office?" "Our things," she corrected him softly, not raising her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence screamed for her. "It's our restaurant, our money, our life that you have been setting on fire. I didn't go through your private things. I went through the records of our business, the business I helped build." He started to bluster, to deny, to deflect. He called her naive, accused her of not understanding the costs of doing business, of being a hysterical spying wife. But his words had no power here. Every time he tried to build a lie, she would simply tap a finger on a line item. "Was the hotel in Napa a cost of doing business?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. "Was the diamond necklace for a client? Tell me, Richard, which client was it? Because I'd love to thank her for her patronage." He deflated, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind the pathetic, hollow shell of a man caught in his own web of lies. He finally slumped into a chair, the one at the other end of the table, miles away from her. "What do you want, Amelia?" he finally whispered, defeated. Her back was straight, her hands folded calmly on the table. She looked at him, the man she had loved, the man who had dismissed her as just a housewife, and she felt not hatred, but a kind of pitying finality. The shift was complete. He was no longer the one in charge. "I want you to pack a bag," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "And then, I want you to sign over your shares of the Gilded Spoon to me. You will walk away. You will not fight this. You will not cause a scene. You will disappear from the business, and you will disappear from this house." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in years. He wasn't seeing the quiet woman who polished his furniture. He was seeing the woman who had just dismantled his entire life with the quiet efficiency she usually reserved for spring cleaning, and he was terrified. "You can't do that," he stammered. "I can," Amelia said, a flicker of that unfamiliar smile returning. "I just did. You said it yourself, Richard. You don't know what you'd do without me. Now, you get to find out." Richard's departure was not a dramatic storm, but a quiet, pathetic fizzle. He packed his expensive suits into leather suitcases, his movements clumsy and resentful. He didn't look at Amelia as he left, couldn't meet the gaze of the woman he had so profoundly underestimated. As the front door clicked shut, a silence descended upon the house. But it was a different kind of silence than the one she had lived in for 20 years. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of a blank page, waiting for a new story to be written. It was the silence of absolute ownership. The next morning, Amelia walked through the doors of the Gilded Spoon, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. The staff, accustomed to Richard's boisterous, high-spending leadership, saw her as an intruder, the quiet wife who had somehow staged a coup. Whispers followed her as she walked through the dining room. Chef Antoine, a man who wore his culinary awards like armor, stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of professional disdain. Maria, a veteran server who had been there since the beginning, offered a hesitant, pitying smile. Amelia called a full staff meeting. They gathered in the main dining room, a collection of nervous and skeptical faces. She didn't stand at a podium. She stood among them. "Good morning," she began, her voice not loud but carrying a new, unshakable authority. "I know this is an abrupt change and that you have questions. I want to be clear. My name is Amelia, and I am not just Richard's wife. I was his original partner. This restaurant was my dream, too." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And I know that dream has been lost. We have become a place that is expensive but not valuable. We have become cold." She turned her gaze to Chef Antoine. "Chef, your technique is a marvel, but your food has no soul. It is made to be photographed, not to be remembered." Antoine bristled. "Madame, my food has won 3 awards. It is the pinnacle of modern cuisine." "Awards are for critics," Amelia countered gently. "Memories are for people. I want to cook for people." She then looked at the entire staff. "Things are going to be different. I don't want to be the most exclusive restaurant in the city. I want to be its most beloved. Some of you may not want to be a part of that journey, and I will understand. But for those who stay, you will be part of building something real." The first weeks were a brutal test of her resolve. As news of Richard's ousting spread, the high-roller clientele vanished. The reservation book, once full weeks in advance, was now terrifyingly empty. The silence of her house was one thing. The silence of an empty 100-seat dining room was a crushing weight. Doubt, a cold and creeping vine, began to wrap around her heart in the dead of night. She had to use her own personal savings, the money she had carefully managed for 2 decades, just to make payroll. She saw the fear in her staff's eyes and felt the immense pressure to prove she hadn't just destroyed all of their livelihoods. Her greatest challenge remained Chef Antoine. He resisted her at every turn, viewing her ideas as a regression to peasant food. The confrontation came to a head one afternoon in the gleaming, state-of-the-art kitchen. "This menu is a disaster," he declared, throwing a proposal she had drafted onto the steel counter. "Farm to table? Rustic stews? Madame, this is a kitchen, not a barn." Amelia didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye. "Antoine, when you were a boy and you were sick, what did your mother cook for you?" The question caught him off guard. He scowled. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," she insisted. "What was it?" He was silent for a long moment, the anger in his face softening into something distant, something vulnerable. "A chicken soup," he finally mumbled, "with fat noodles and dill." "Then that is what you will cook for me tomorrow," Amelia said. "No fancy garnishes, no deconstruction, just the soup. Cook it for me, and then we will talk about the menu." The next day, a single bowl of soup sat on the table in the empty dining room. It was simple, fragrant, and profoundly honest. Amelia took a spoonful, and she smiled. Then she passed the bowl to Antoine. He tasted his own creation, and something inside him broke. A tear traced a path down his cheek, a drop of salt water in a sea of forgotten flavor. He remembered not the ambition that drove him, but the love that first made him want to cook. It was the turning point. From that day on, they were a team. He brought his technical genius, and she brought her heart. They renamed the menu The Spoon's Story. Every dish, from grandmother's braised lamb to Mr. Henderson's autumn harvest, came with a short description of its origins. Amelia rehired the old farmer, and the arrival of his truck, laden with fresh, muddy vegetables, became a celebrated daily ritual. She found the soft, hand-stitched curtains she'd made years ago in a storage closet, had them cleaned, and hung them back up, replacing the cold, severe blinds Richard had installed. Slowly, miraculously, things began to change. A local food blogger, hearing whispers of a revolution at the city's stuffiest restaurant, came in anonymously. Her review went viral. She wrote not of the gold, but of the warmth. She wrote of a chicken soup that tasted like home, and of a proprietor who moved through the room like she was welcoming you into her own heart. The new customers started to arrive. They weren't the ones who came to be seen. They were the ones who came to connect. Families celebrating birthdays, young couples on first dates, old friends finding comfort in a shared meal. The sound of the restaurant changed from a hushed, reverent whisper to a joyful, contented hum of conversation and laughter. Months later, on a busy Saturday night, Amelia stood near the entrance, a place she now occupied with ease and grace. She saw Chef Antoine, no longer a stiff culinary general, but a passionate artist, leaning over a stove, showing a young cook how to properly season a sauce. She saw Maria, her smile now genuine and bright, sharing a laugh with a table of regulars. And at a quiet corner table, she saw Mr. Henderson and his wife, treated as guests of honor, celebrating their wedding anniversary. She had done more than take back a restaurant. She had resurrected its soul. She had built a community. She looked at her reflection in the front window and saw a woman defined not by the man she had left, but by the world she had built. They had called her just a housewife. They were right. It was the skills of a housewife, the tireless care, the fierce budgeting, the profound ability to make a house into a home, that had been her greatest strengths all along. She hadn't needed to become a different person. She only needed to unleash the person she had always been. And so, Amelia's story reminds us that the titles others give us are meaningless. It is the power we find in ourselves that truly defines us. Strength is not always a shout. Often it is the quiet, persistent work of a heart that refuses to be ignored. If you have ever felt that your contributions are invisible, or that your voice is too quiet to be heard, remember Amelia. Remember that within you lies a unique strength, ready for its moment. We hope her story has inspired you. If it has, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of courage and renewal. Until next time, cherish your own story, and never be afraid to take back the pen and write a new ending.